December 1944, the Ardennes Forest. For the soldiers of the German 6th Panzer Army, this was the beginning of the end, just not the one they were promised. They were told this was Hitler's final, brilliant stroke. A surprise attack so powerful, so overwhelming, it would shatter the Allied armies and force them to beg for peace. They were the tip of a spear forged in secret, aimed at the heart of an enemy that had grown complacent and weak. They had trained for the artillery. They knew its rhythm, the whistle of the incoming shell, the mad dive into a foxhole, the violent eruption of earth and iron. They knew how to survive the ground war. But this was different. The shells never landed. They didn't tear craters in the frozen ground. Instead, something impossible happened. The sky itself exploded. In that frozen forest, the fundamental rule of warfare, a rule that had held true for 1,000 years, was broken. The safety of the earth was a lie. Foxholes became graves. Trenches became traps. For the German soldier, there was no longer anywhere to hide. They would later swear the shells had eyes, that they were being hunted by a ghost. They were wrong. They weren't being hunted by a ghost. They were being erased by a secret born not on the battlefield, but in the minds of scientists, forged by the full might of American industry and hidden inside an ordinary-looking artillery shell. This is the story of the weapon you've never heard of, the weapon that truly won the Battle of the Bulge and turned Hitler's last great gamble into the graveyard of his empire. By the autumn of 1944, the Third Reich was dying. The Allied landings at Normandy had ripped open the Western Front. Paris was liberated. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet war machine was a relentless grinder, chewing through German armies and pushing ever closer to Berlin. German cities were turning to ash under carpets of bombs. The war was, by any rational measure, lost, but Adolf Hitler was not a rational man. He saw one last sliver of hope, a single desperate chance to reverse the tide. He looked at a map of the front lines and pointed to a quiet 85-mile stretch of dense forest and rolling hills. The Ardennes. It was the same place his armies had stormed through 4 years earlier in their stunning defeat of France. He believed lightning could strike twice. He called the plan Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, a deliberately defensive name to mask its brutally offensive purpose. The objective? Smash through the weakly defended American lines, race to the Meuse River, and then seize the critical port of Antwerp. Doing so would cut the Allied armies in two. It would strand the British and Canadian forces in the north, cutting off their supplies and forcing a catastrophic retreat. Hitler dreamed it would be a second Dunkirk, a disaster so profound it would shatter the Anglo-American alliance and force a negotiated peace. To his stunned generals, he promised a miracle. "This battle," he declared, "is to decide whether we shall live or die. All of the anger, all of the hatred, must be transformed into a fire that will now be hurled at the enemy." And he had assembled the tools to do it. Over 200,000 soldiers, many of them fresh from the Eastern Front, hardened and ruthless. More than 1,000 tanks, including the terrifying King Tiger, a 70-ton monster that no Allied tank could match. They were supported by nearly 2,000 artillery pieces, all hidden under the perpetual fog and gloom of the forest. It was the largest concentration of German military power assembled for a single operation on the Western Front, and their target was almost completely unaware. The Ardennes had become the Allies' ghost front, a place where green, untested divisions were sent to get their first taste of Europe, a place where battle-hardened but exhausted units were sent for rest and recovery. Allied High Command was so certain Germany was finished, so focused on planning their own attacks, they committed one of the greatest intelligence failures of the war. They saw the reports of troop movements but dismissed them as defensive. They intercepted communications but misinterpreted them. They believed the Germans were incapable of launching a major offensive. They believed the Ardennes forest itself was impassable for a large armored force in winter. They were wrong on every single count. At 5:30 a.m. on December 16, 1944, hell was unleashed. 1,600 German guns opened fire simultaneously. The surprise was absolute. American communication lines were severed in minutes. Command posts vanished. Forward positions were simply erased from existence. Out of the fog came the stormtroopers and the Panzers, an iron tide that crashed into the thin American defenses. Entire regiments dissolved. In the chaos, small pockets of men were left to fight and die alone. staging heroic but hopeless stands at tiny villages and crucial crossroads. One such unit was the 38th Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and on the verge of being annihilated. Their desperate calls for artillery support were answered, but the conventional shells were doing little to stop the German advance. Watching this disaster unfold was one man, Colonel Oscar Alfred Axelson, commander of the 406th Artillery Group. He knew the line was about to break. He knew if it did, the road would be wide open for the German Panzers, and he knew he was holding an ace up his sleeve, a weapon so secret, so revolutionary. He was under strict orders never to use it over land, where a dud shell could be recovered by the enemy. But orders written in the comfort of headquarters mean little when you can hear your men screaming for their lives over the radio. In that moment, Colonel Axelson made a decision that would not only save his men, but would change the face of warfare forever. To understand the weapon he was about to unleash, we have to go back, not to an armory, but to a laboratory. The story of this weapon begins in 1940, before America was even in the war. The threat was not German tanks, but Japanese aircraft. As Britain endured the Blitz, American military planners looked at the horrifying effectiveness of aerial bombing and realized they had a massive problem. Conventional anti-aircraft shells were incredibly inefficient. They relied on a simple timer fuse. Gunners had to calculate the target's speed, altitude, and direction, then set the fuse to explode at a specific time, hoping the shell and the plane would arrive at the same point in the sky at the exact same instant. It was like trying to shoot a clay pigeon with a rifle, blindfolded. The odds of a direct hit were astronomical. It took, on average, over 2,000 shells to bring down a single enemy aircraft. The sky was filled with black puffs of smoke, but most of them were useless. America needed a smarter shell, a shell that could think for itself. The task fell to a team of brilliant civilian scientists under the leadership of physicist Dr. Merle Tuve at Johns Hopkins University. Their department, the Applied Physics Laboratory, was a top-secret research hub disguised as a used car dealership in Silver Spring, Maryland. Behind that mundane facade, they were tackling a problem that seemed like science fiction. Could they build a complete radar system, shrink it down to the size of a coffee can, and make it rugged enough to survive being fired out of a cannon? The concept was deceptively simple. The shell would contain a tiny radio transmitter, constantly sending out a signal. When that signal bounced off a target, like an airplane, and returned to a receiver in the fuse, the change in frequency would trigger the detonator. The shell wouldn't need a timer. It wouldn't need a direct hit. It just needed to get close. Hence the name, the proximity fuse. But the engineering challenges were staggering. It was considered by many to be impossible. In fact, German scientists at Rheinmetall had worked on a similar idea, but abandoned it. Their top engineers declared it too complex, too fragile. Hitler, obsessed with short-term wonder weapons, canceled any project that would take longer than 6 months. It was a catastrophic lack of vision that would later come back to haunt them. The American scientists, however, did not give up. Consider what they were up against. The components inside the fuse had to withstand forces almost beyond comprehension. First, the launch. The instant the cannon fired, the fuse was subjected to 20,000 times the force of gravity. Imagine an object weighing 1 pound suddenly weighing 10 tons. Delicate electronics would be crushed into powder. Second, the spin. To remain stable in flight, an artillery shell spins at up to 30,000 revolutions per minute. This centrifugal force would tear ordinary components from their mountings and sling them against the outer casing. And third, the power source. The fuse needed a battery, but no conventional battery could survive the launch. It had to be inert until the exact moment it was fired. For 2 years, Tuve and his team worked relentlessly. They invented solutions that were nothing short of genius. To power the fuse, they designed a small glass ampule filled with electrolyte. When the shell was fired, the G-force would shatter the ampule, instantly activating a battery and bringing the fuse to life. To protect the delicate electronics, they didn't use glass vacuum tubes like you'd find in a radio. They developed new, ruggedized tubes made of metal and ceramic, some no bigger than a pencil eraser. Each one was a miniature miracle of engineering. They then suspended this entire tiny circuit in a block of wax and resin, cushioning it against the brutal shock of launch. Solving the science was only half the battle. Now they had to build it. And this is where the story shifts from a few brilliant minds in a lab to the awesome power of American industry. The project, codenamed VT for Variable Time, grew into a colossal undertaking, second only in cost and complexity to the Manhattan Project. Over 100 different companies, including giants like RCA, General Electric, and Sylvania, were brought in. Factories that once made refrigerators and radios were retooled to mass-produce top-secret military hardware. The work was painstaking. Each fuse contained 130 separate components, every one of which had to be perfect. The workforce, often young women who had never held a soldering iron before, worked 12-hour shifts with microscopic precision. Every joint, every wire was inspected. A single bad connection could render the entire device useless. By 1944, American factories were churning out 40,000 proximity fuses every single day. It was an industrial achievement the Axis powers simply could not comprehend, let alone match. Over $1 billion, a staggering sum at the time, was spent perfecting the weapon. It was first deployed with the Navy in 1943, where it proved devastatingly effective against Japanese aircraft in the Pacific. But on land, its use was forbidden. The risk of the secret falling into enemy hands was deemed too great. If the Germans got their hands on a working fuse, they could copy it, use it against Allied bomber fleets, and change the course of the air war. So the shells sat in guarded depots across Europe, a silver bullet the Army was forbidden to fire. Which brings us back to Colonel Axelson, standing in the frozen mud of his command post, listening to his men being overrun. He had the silver bullet. He had thousands of them, and he was faced with an impossible choice: obey his orders and risk a catastrophic defeat, or unleash America's most guarded secret, and pray the consequences didn't doom them all. The German Panzers were breaking through. The screams on the radio were growing fainter. The time for deliberation was over. Axelson, to all batteries, load the VT. I repeat, load the variable time fuses. Fire at will. The order was given. A violation of protocol. A career-ending gamble. On battlefields across the Ardennes, American gunners unlocked the secret crates. They carefully screwed the special fuses onto the tips of their 105mm shells. For the first time over European soil, the shells with eyes were about to open them. The German soldiers advancing through the snow, confident in their numbers and their training, had no idea that the very air above their heads was about to be turned into a weapon of unimaginable lethality. The battle for the Bulge was about to enter a new, terrifying chapter. The order was given, a gamble that broke every rule, as the first shells armed with America's greatest secret screamed into the winter sky. The laws of physics took over. Inside each fuse, a marvel of miniaturized technology came to life. A circuit, dormant moments before, now sent out invisible radio waves, scanning the earth below. The German soldiers of the 326th Volksgrenadier Division, advancing confidently towards the town of Monschau, heard the familiar shriek of incoming artillery. They did what their training had taught them. They dropped into foxholes, hugged the frozen ground, and braced for the impact. But the ground remained silent. Instead, high above the treetops, the sky tore open. It was a slaughter unlike anything they had ever conceived. The proximity fuse had calculated the perfect altitude, 30 to 50 feet, and detonated, showering down a cone of red-hot steel fragments at supersonic speed. The forest canopy, which should have offered protection, became a secondary weapon as the blast turned branches and splinters into a storm of wooden spears. The foxholes they had dug for safety offered none. The shrapnel rained down vertically, finding men wherever they hid. Veterans who had survived the horrors of Stalingrad, men who believed they had seen everything war had to offer, were cut to pieces in seconds. Reports sent back to German command were filled with panic and disbelief. The attack on Monschau stalled, then collapsed. Survivors babbled about new terrifying weapons. Was it a chemical attack? A new type of bomb? The initial reports were dismissed as battlefield hysteria, but the hysteria was spreading because the secret was now out of the box, and it was appearing everywhere. Nowhere was the situation more desperate than at the Belgian crossroads town of Bastogne. Here, the American 101st Airborne Division was completely surrounded, outnumbered 5 to 1, and running desperately low on ammunition, food, and medical supplies. They were the nail sticking up, the one obstacle preventing the Germans from racing to the Meuse River. When the German commander sent a message demanding their surrender, the American commander, General Anthony McAuliffe, gave a one-word reply that would become legend. Nuts! It was an act of supreme defiance. But defiance alone doesn't stop Panzer tanks. The Germans launched wave after wave of attacks, certain they could crush the surrounded paratroopers. But the 101st had a guardian angel they didn't even know about. The artillery units supporting them, like the 463rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion, had just received shipments of the new proximity-fused shells. From the perspective of a paratrooper in his foxhole, it was a miracle. The German infantry would advance across the open snow, a moving forest of gray coats, and then without warning, the sky above them would erupt in fire and steel. Entire platoons would simply vanish. The American shells seemed to anticipate every move, creating an impenetrable wall of death that no German soldier could cross. Fighting with them, and often overlooked by history, was the 969th Field Artillery Battalion, an African-American unit that performed with incredible bravery and precision. They laid down a curtain of fire around Bastonia's perimeter, sealing it from the German assaults. Their guns roared day and night, their proximity-fused shells breaking assault after assault. The siege of Bastonia held, not just because of the paratroopers' grit, but because their artillery now had a secret, decisive edge. Further north, at a vital piece of high ground called Elsenborn Ridge, the Germans threw their absolute best into the fight. This wasn't just any unit. It was the elite 6th SS Panzer Army, including the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler Division, the Führer's personal bodyguard. They were the ideological heart of the Nazi war machine, fanatically loyal and ruthlessly effective. They had never been stopped. Here they met the U.S. 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions. For 3 hellish days, the SS stormed the snow-covered slopes, determined to break the American line, and the American guns answered them with a storm of biblical proportions. Over 160,000 shells fell on those slopes, but a quarter of them, 40,000, were armed with proximity fuses. Post-battle analysis revealed a stunning statistic. Those 40,000 shells caused more than 60% of all German casualties. The effect was apocalyptic. SS veterans later described climbing ridges over mounds of their own dead, only to be scythed down by the next volley of airbursts. The psychological impact was even greater than the physical. The myth of SS invincibility, a myth carefully crafted by years of propaganda, was shattered in a matter of hours against an invisible, untouchable fire that rained from the sky. All across the front, the story was the same. The German offensive, launched with such precision and power, began to bog down and then bleed out, and in its ranks, fear turned to terror. Prisoners of war, when interrogated, couldn't properly describe what they were facing. They called it magic fire and airborne shrapnel. They told stories of entire companies being wiped out without a single crater being formed in the ground. They warned that trees were now as dangerous as bullets, as the airbursts turned the forest itself into a weapon. The Wehrmacht, one of the most disciplined and effective fighting forces in history, began to break. No amount of training could prepare a man for a weapon that rendered every instinct for survival useless. Spreading out only exposed you to the wide kill zone of the shrapnel cone. Bunching up meant a single shell could annihilate your entire squad. There was no countermeasure. There was no tactic. There was no hope. With his ground offensive stalling, Hitler played his final card. On New Year's Day 1945, he launched Operation Bodenplatte. It was a last-ditch effort to cripple Allied air power on the ground. Over 900 German fighters roared into the sky at dawn, striking airfields in a stunningly successful surprise attack. But as the victorious German pilots turned for home, the proximity fuse was waiting for them. The Allied anti-aircraft gunners, now equipped with proximity-fused shells, no longer had to be perfect. They just had to be close. The fuses automatically detected the aircraft, transforming every shell into a guided missile of shrapnel. Of the 277 German planes lost that day, an astonishing 172 were brought down by anti-aircraft fire. The Luftwaffe, already crippled by years of war, was effectively wiped out as a fighting force in a single morning. Hitler's last gamble had failed on the ground, and now it had failed in the air. By January, the tide had completely turned. General George S. Patton's Third Army had relieved the heroes of Bastonia, and Allied forces were pushing the Germans back across the board. The Battle of the Bulge was over. In his memoirs, Patton, a man not known for crediting technology over fighting spirit, was unequivocal. He wrote simply, "The funny fuse won the Battle of the Bulge for us. When the guns fell silent, the cost was laid bare. Over 100,000 German casualties, 75,000 American. A brutal, bloody affair that scarred a generation. But buried in those numbers was a hidden truth. The 200,000 proximity-fused shells fired had, according to Allied analysts, multiplied the effectiveness of their artillery by 5 to 10 times. They had broken attacks that would have otherwise succeeded. They had saved countless thousands of American lives, and they had decisively shortened the war in Europe. The German commanders knew it. Field Marshal von Rundstedt, the overall commander of the offensive, admitted after the war, "The proximity fuse was decisive. Our attacks broke down because of artillery that seemed to have eyes. But the legacy of the proximity fuse extends far beyond the snows of the Ardennes. It was the birth of a new age, the age of smart weapons. The techniques of miniaturization and ruggedization pioneered for the fuse became the foundation of modern electronics. Dr. James Van Allen, a key scientist on the project, would later use the same principles to build instruments for satellites, discovering the Earth's radiation belts that now bear his name. The fuse was the direct ancestor of every guided missile, every cruise missile, and every smart bomb that would define warfare for the rest of the 20th century and beyond. It was the moment the battlefield ceased to be ruled by men alone and began to be ruled by machines that could sense, calculate, and decide. It looks like nothing special, a simple piece of machined steel. But inside this object lies the story of a nation's hidden might, the story of scientists who achieved the impossible, of factory workers who built a miracle, and of a single colonel who made a daring choice. It is proof that sometimes the course of history isn't changed by the grand sweep of armies, but by a tiny, brilliant secret, a secret that gave artillery a brain and gave shells eyes.